What does it take to build a sports brand from absolutely nothing? No history, no fan, no stadium of your own, in a city that already lives and breathes its teams. This week, Adam sits down with Amina Bulman, Chief Revenue Officer, Boston Legacy FC. Amina's path into sports wasn't a straight line. It barely looked like a line at all. A lifelong rower who studied political science and economics, she expected to spend her career in and around government. Instead, she went from a public sector consulting practice to the early days of the Obama Foundation, to an MBA that finished right as the world shut down in spring of 2020. Then came a phone call that changed everything. A former mentor asked me to help turn around the franchise that had just become the Washington Commanders. 5 years and one 90-year-old rebrand later, she came home to Boston to help launch a club starting from zero. In this conversation, Amina and Adam get into what it really means to build in transition, leading teams when you're not an expert in the room, the difference between information and insight, and why her first season feels like running two races at once across two very different stadiums. And then there's the real estate. Amina makes the case that mixed use is the future of sports venues, from White Stadium, a dual-use home shared with the Boston Public Schools, to the Grove, a 365-day gathering space designed to keep the lights on long after the final whistle. Women's sports, she says, are on a rocket ship, and she gives her blueprint, keeping it climbing. I'm Bryce Clinton, and this is the Roar Podcast.
Welcome to the Roar Podcast. I'm your host, Adam Grossman. With us today is Amina Bulman. Amina, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me, Adam.
Well, it's great to have you on the show. You and I connected originally at the Sports Business Journal Awards, where we were both judges. So that was very exciting. It was great to meet you and great to talk to you. And one of the things that I really found interesting about our conversation is just your background, your experience, how you got to the role today. You've had a really interesting career date, and that's where we want to start, which is tell us how you got to your role at the Boston Legacy.
Thanks, Adam, and thanks so much for having me on the podcast today. I took a bit of a circuitous path to my role today. It was certainly not where I thought I would be when I was, graduating college and putting together my 5, 10, 15-year plan, none of which has come true, spoiler alert.
I was guess on a separate podcast, we'll talk about all those plans.
Yeah, exactly.
What those are.
But so going all the way back, just because it's context for how I ended up in this role today, but I grew up in Boston. I'm the oldest of 3 girls. I was always an athlete. I was a rower through high school and college. And sports have always been just incredibly important to me, both as a fan, but also as a participant. I think being an athlete has really shaped my leadership style, how I, relate to my friends and family. So many of my best friends are, former teammates of mine. And so sports has always just played a central role in my life, but I never imagined that it would be part of my career. Growing up, I didn't know anybody who worked in sports. I didn't really know of roles in sports. It was just not even an industry that was on my radar. I studied political science and economics, thought I was going to spend my career working in and around the government. And so right after college, I moved down to DC and started working for a big consulting firm in their public sector practice and did that for a couple years and really enjoyed it, but wanted to do something that felt a little bit more entrepreneurial. So left to go help start up the Obama Foundation in its very early days and was working on sort of strategy and operations and building out their civic engagement programming. Again, very, very different. Decided after some time there that I wanted to go back and get my MBA at the time because, I thought I really wanted to bring some of the rigor that I loved from the business world sort of back into the nonprofit world. But graduated from business school right at the start of COVID and spring of 2020, and got a call from a former mentor of mine who was leaving the consulting firm where we had both worked to go be the president of the then Washington football team. They'd changed their name from Redskins 1 week before. And he said, "Do you want to come with me and help turn around this organization?" And I had never, I'd been to Patriots games because I grew up in New England, but certainly would not have considered myself to be a diehard fan. I knew absolutely nothing about the business of sports, but he knew that I cared deeply about cultures and teams and how you bring people together to try and accomplish really hard goals. And I just was really drawn to the challenge and the opportunity to learn quickly and really make a difference in the world of professional sports. And so I took the leap and thought I would be there for 1 year. But, as I think many folks in this industry know, sort of the rest is history. You get hooked and you fall in love with the people and the problems. And so I've been here ever since. I did 5 years at the Commanders and then just about a year ago came back to Boston to help start up the Legacy.
There's a lot of things there that we want to get into. But one of the things I thought that was interesting, because this is the same with me, is I never thought about working in a career in sports. This may be a question for both of us. You think there is a reason that you never thought about it, even though you had sports as a big part of your life growing up, or is it something that never came across your radar screen?
Part of it is that, especially if you work on the team side, on the club side,
Yeah.
it can be a pretty small industry. It can feel
Yeah.
pretty insular. And people develop deep expertise in functions of this industry that is not necessarily as transferable as moving from a marketing role in insurance to a marketing role in financial services. If you deeply know how to sell tickets,
Yeah.
that yes, there are certain other industries, but like you're sort of looking in sports media and entertainment. And so I just didn't know people coming in and out of those kinds of roles. And I think it's sort of, once you're in, you're in. But if you don't have family or friends who have worked in this industry, it does feel pretty opaque.
Yeah, that's a good point. From my own experience was more like exactly what you're saying. I didn't know anybody who worked in it. It didn't even occur to me to think about the business side of the sports team while I was playing sports. Obviously, there are whole programs. I teach in one of the programs now where there's whole programs dedicated to sports. There's so many young adults now who think of this as a career choice for them, which was never on my radar when I was their age.
Well, and I actually think one of the few functions where there is more cross pollination with other industries is the data and analytics side,
Yeah, that's
because
a good point.
there is so much the sports world has to learn from other industries. And it's an area where I think someone like you, Adam, can really provide outsized value because of your experience in other industries in ways that might just be less applicable than some of the other core functions. And so when I think about hiring for my team and the skills I'm looking at, data and analytics is actually one of the areas where I say, obviously I want some element of sports experience and sports expertise. I'm really open to looking at folks who have built deep experience in data analytics or CRM or what have you in other industries, because that is quite transferable to our work.
That's a good segue to the next question. Although I appreciate you saying that about data analytics, about me and about our background, and happy to talk about that more a little bit later. But as you mentioned, you came from outside the sports industry. Obviously, you had a politics and government background. How do you think that impacts your career going forward, that you had this experience outside of sports prior to having experience inside of sports?
I'm always surprised by how different experience that I've had sort of show up and inform the way I think about certain kinds of work in ways that are sometimes completely surprising. But I'll give you a good example. We are at Boston Legacy FC. We are building a new stadium with the city of Boston. It's right in the heart of the city, and as anyone who's ever been a part of building a new stadium knows, there is an extensive public-private process. There's a lot of media. It is just very much in the public eye. And I felt like I had a little bit of a taste of that because when I was at the Obama Foundation, we were trying to open the Obama Presidential Center and Library and went through a very similar process and just sort of multi-year endeavor. And so I never thought that one would prepare me for the other, but you end up sort of pulling on these different elements of your experience in ways that are never sort of predictable at the time.
And obviously, Obama Library is opening very soon, so it's a
Yes, I can't wait to go see it.
long journey. But are there other lessons learned? Again, as you mentioned, it's a long journey. Maybe took longer than people would have anticipated. But is there other things that you've learned from that experience that you've translated into sports?
I think one of the things a skill that I've had to learn just because I've jumped into so many different types of roles and picked up different functions along the way is just the value of curiosity and asking good questions and learning how to add value when you are not a subject matter expert. Because, especially in my first few years working in sports, but certainly still now, it is so, so, so rare that I am the person in the room who knows the most or has the most depth of knowledge about a subject matter. And even when I think about how I build my teams, I try to surround myself with people who have really deep subject matter expertise in areas that I don't. And so figuring out how I can unlock value for them, help them solve problems, help them understand what problems need to be solved first and with what level of urgency, like that's a skill that I think I've been able to pick up because of how diverse my experience has been. Prize about myself and, would like to keep developing that.
I think that's a very laudable skill, is to try to help people who have functional experience that you don't have, but putting them in a position to be successful. So what did you learn in previous parts of your career that's something you focus on or able to be successful at?
I always tell my teens that I have two main jobs, well, really three main jobs. as it relates to them. One is helping them stay connected and informed across the organization. So if I oversee 5 different diverse functions, I need to be able to create that connective tissue and set up both the operating model where they can do that, but also just make sure that they're getting the right information at the right times to do their jobs well. The second is clearing roadblocks for them and helping them get the resources that they need to be successful. And sometimes that is more money, but sometimes it's not more money, right? Sometimes it's connections to somebody else who has been in their seat, or maybe it's a conversation with an investor who can unlock something, but sort of resourcing and problem solving. And then the third thing that I think I need to do as a leader for all of my teams, and it's related to 1 and 2, is create the pathways for them to learn the skills to one day be team presidents themselves. Or maybe they don't want to be a team president, they want to be something else. But I do think part of my role is about creating those opportunities for them to take safe risks and try new things and stretch a little bit that they might not even see themselves that they're capable of, but I can sort of set up those opportunities for them to stretch and learn and grow.
Is there a good example recently that you can think about or talk about of doing that for somebody on your team where they were able to stretch themselves?
Yeah, I have somebody who works on my ticket sales team who wants to be a chief revenue officer someday. And so I had him join me on a sales pitch with a brand that's sort of in the ticketing and resale ecosystem, and sort of help him learn how I talk about the brand, what kinds of questions to ask, how to sort of lead with a consultative approach in a potential partnership. And I think just having him ride alongside me gave him a little bit of a taste of what this might look like, and gave him a sort of just a model or an example of what this kind of work might look like.
Yeah, and I know we fast forward a little bit to your role at the Legacy. I want to dive into that in more detail. You came to what are now the Commanders, obviously, as you mentioned, were the Washington football team at the time. You mentioned, I believe you were referencing Jason Wright, maybe reached out to you. Is scheduled to be our podcast guest next week, so good
Good.
connective tissue for that. Obviously, he reached out to you, and it was an interesting opportunity. But what was compelling to you to leap in with the Washington football team at the time, given where the team was when you joined in the first place?
Well, I'm so glad you have Jason on next week because you can quiz him on all of the things I'm going to tell you about. But I
Good.
mean, the first thing really was the opportunity to work with Jason. I think there are leaders who invest in you early in your career who you will run through walls for. And Jason was my very first boss out of college. I've known him since I was 22, and I give him a huge amount of credit for my own career trajectory. And he was just somebody who, given the chance to work with him, I will always say yes. So that was certainly a big part of it. And just I think when you're considering an opportunity that is both high reward but also high risk, knowing that you are able to do it alongside of a leader who you really trust makes a big difference. I also saw this opportunity as a huge chance for me to really learn both about the industry of sports, but also learn about the fundamental dynamics of a business in transition. This was an organization that was fundamentally rebranding after 90 years, that had a ton of opportunity on the commercial side, that had a lot of opportunity on the fan experience side, and that was in the hunt for a potential new stadium. And that, like, I got all of the most interesting problems in sports rolled into one opportunity. And in many ways, it felt like just a crash course, or sort of my real life MBA, not only in sports, but just in sort of business more broadly, and how you shepherd an organization through a time of transition. And I've always been really curious about that. And it sort of gave me a front row seat to all of those dynamics.
And how do you shepherd an organization like that in a transition? Obviously, you led a lot of the branding and rebranding work that happened, which I'm from that area. I know about the original brand. It's something that, just as a fan, is something that was very important to me. But so you were dealing with a lot there. So what did you learn from that experience, given how public and visible, particularly the rebrand was?
Yeah, well, you make a lot of mistakes along the way. You do the best I think this is true for any sort of leader navigating through uncertainty, but you make the best decisions you can with the information that you have, and you never have the amount of information that you want to have to feel really confident in those decisions. And so I think I got a lot more comfortable operating in ambiguity and doing my best to obviously, craft a data-driven strategy, but also knowing that there were some things I was never going to know, and we were going to have to sort of commit to an approach and learn what we could along the way. I mean, I give so much credit to the team that joined Jason and myself in those early months and early years, because every person who joined that organization knew that they were joining an organization in transition, and knew that it would be a rough ride and there would be ups and downs. And all of those individuals showed a real commitment to putting the team before themselves and building something greater than themselves. And I really do think like one of the core elements to helping an organization navigate that kind of change is building a team that brings a level of selflessness and thoughtfulness to the work. And that sort of allows everyone to stay oriented around like the North Star of what's best for the organization and like keep the main thing, which I think can be really challenging when there's just so much going on.
That's a great point. Again, I know I keep asking this. You have very direct real world experiences on core challenges that are important to people who are in senior positions or looking to be in senior positions. But more specifically and granularly, how did you deal with the ambiguity? How are you able to keep the main thing, the main, when all of this is happening around you?
Well, I'll take the rebrand specifically as an example because that was a project that had a huge amount of complexity. I think really importantly, a lot of just emotions
Yes,
involved,
exactly.
like deep, deep feelings and sentiment from fans, from investors, from staff, from players. There were a lot of
Yeah.
stakeholders.
And all sides. It wasn't like necessarily clear, right? One,
All
yeah.
sides, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, different sentiment on all sides, and frankly, not a ton of great data on that let us say like with certainty, here's where everybody stands, and there is a monolithic opinion from this group of stakeholders. And by the way, like those opinions were changing by the day. And, you know, 2020 feels so long ago, actually, in so many ways, but like placing ourselves in that moment, George Floyd and COVID. And like it was a very sort of specific time in corporate America in particular where brands were thinking about the role they played sort of in society and the leadership role that they played. And so all of that, I think, weighed very heavily on us as we were thinking about how to shepherd this organization, which again was 90 years old, sort of had a huge amount of history and gravitas and legacy and just generations of investment from fans, from owners, from staff, from players. And so you asked sort of like how to navigate through ambiguity. I think our solution was to try to do that with a high degree of care and of input. And one of the things that there are many things that did not go perfectly, but one of the things that I'm very proud of that we did and that I brought to Boston Legacy when I led the rebrand here was to really deeply engage fans and have them feel a part of the process and understand at really a values level what they wanted to see in this organization and how we could build a brand and an entity that they were proud of, proud to wear on their chests, proud to bring their kids to games. Because business challenges with that level of complexity, ambiguity, emotion can't be solved by sitting at your desk and thinking about it. They have to be solved sort of in community, and they have to be solved by bringing a lot of perspectives into the fold. And it doesn't mean we were going to leave the name up to direct democracy and, people were just going to vote on a slate, but it did mean a real sense of obligation to the people who had built the brand, who had built the organization, and who really felt represented by it to do right by them in the next iteration.
As you just mentioned, it's not direct democracy. So how do you get all these different stakeholders to buy in and feel heard and feel listened to?
Yeah. Part of it is about like setting the appropriate expectations. And I think sometimes
Yeah.
we did this well and sometimes we didn't. And, we spent a lot of time with fans understanding what mattered to them and how that could show up in sort of the values of the brand and the pillars. And, a name is so much more than a name. It's not like, there's 10 names and you sort of pick which one sounds right. You really need to think through what stands behind that name and the brand that you build around it and what opportunities are there for storytelling and emotional resonance and connection. And so I think we did that work. I think what was more challenging was just the complexities of people falling in love with a single moniker or a word, right? I like the sound of this, I like the sound of this, I like this because it sounds like the old brand, I like this because it doesn't sound like the old brand. And then when you add in the layers of trademark law and legal clearances, like there it just becomes a complex a complex challenge that no one party has sort of full visibility into. And so a lot of what we tried to do was make the complex simple And sometimes that was effective, and sometimes making the complex simple, you lost some of the texture and depth that made this process challenging and worthy and hard. And so that was just a balance that we tried to strike. And I think sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't.
And then we spent a lot of time on the rebrand, but then one of the things that's interesting from your career journey perspective is you had several different roles beyond just doing the rebrand and you were promoted. So what were some of the other roles that you had with the team and how did your role evolve from where you first were to by the time you left the organization?
So I started out as chief of staff, which I think chief of staff is one of the best jobs that anyone can ever have because you
Yeah.
really get sort of this right-hand seat to how the decision makers operate. But at the time, there were very few chiefs of staff working in professional sports. I think it's become a lot more common, but at the time, I think I was the only one in the NFL, and people like thought I worked in HR. Like nobody knew what a chief of staff was or what a chief of staff was supposed to do. And that was sort of surprising to me because it's so common in many other industries, that sort of that role and that function. And so I loved that because that helped me sort of get the lay of the land of the business and where sort of the big rocks were that needed to move forward. And then as my role expanded, I took on a lot more of the sort of external facing elements of the organization. So comms, our community efforts, which I was very comfortable with having, recently worked on that at the Obama Foundation and having spent a lot of time in nonprofits and sort of my own nonprofit. And so that sort of felt second nature to me in many ways. And then I think sort of as an outgrowth of the work that I'd been doing in community and with fans, working on their rebrand sort of was a natural next step that sort of combined the sort of strategic planning of the chief of staff role and the external engagement of the sort of additional functions that I'd taken on. And then I think also just by nature of the work I'd done in the past, particularly at McKinsey, we sort of added on sort of data and analytics and some of the sort of commercial strategy work to complement that, which I really loved because, again, it sort of gave me a little bit of each part of the business and I think a real focus on how those knit together in a way that could meaningfully move the business forward.
You mentioned some of the projects that you worked on. Are there any that we haven't talked about that have really bubbled to the surface in terms of here are some of the things that I'm really proud of or really excited about that we were able to accomplish while we're part of the football team and now Commanders?
So many. One that I am particularly proud of is how we rebuilt the foundation and our community engagement efforts. And, there are so many fans of professional sports who will never set foot in a stadium. And how we, as people who work at those teams, think about those folks as fans and their experience and how they engage with the club is, as I think, not talked about enough. Like we tend to focus on fans who are in venues, but certainly both from a monetization perspective, but also from a branding community perspective, those are incredibly valuable fans. And I think the work we did to rebuild our community efforts and sort of our civic engagement efforts, for lack of a better word, really helped us build a level of depth and trust in the DC, Maryland, and Virginia area that enabled a bunch of the other maybe flashier projects that we were able to do. And I'll give an example. We opened up our stadium as a safe distance polling site during COVID. And first of all, like just great for residents of Prince George's County to be able to have a safe place to vote, but also for many of the folks who came through on election day, it was their first time ever being inside an NFL stadium. And that I think just creates like an opportunity and experience that I'm proud to have been a part of.
Yeah, it's amazing. From a data that just naturally brain goes, but
Yeah, Adam, you're like, did you get the Wi-Fi? Did you get their emails?
did you get? Did you get? I mean, right? Because some of the things we work on now is expanding the fan universe beyond what's happening in the venue. Was that something you were able to do? People seeing the stadium for the first time is really amazing. I didn't even think of that. I'm glad you brought that up. But were you able to convert them into maybe more substantial Commanders fans at that point?
I don't think we did. That's maybe a missed opportunity, but we certainly I think we reached a new audience because we partnered with folks like the police department and the Secretary of State's office to get the word out. And so just from a brand awareness perspective, I think even if we didn't, we might not have captured all of that data, but I think certainly reached new audiences.
I want to get into your current role, the Boston Legacy, but how did that happen? How were you approached? What was the decision point to leave the Commanders? What was the decision point to go to Boston Legacy? You mentioned you're from Boston. You're obviously, and we'll talk about your commitment to women's sports, but when did you get the call? What was it like? And how did you decide to make the move to Boston?
I had been talking to the founders of the club for actually quite a while. And I knew I wanted to come back to Boston at some point. We had 3 little kids. I was really excited about building something from the ground up. I felt like I'd just been through this massive transformation project and felt like, I wanted to have a chance to sort of, start from the other end of the business cycle. And I saw so much opportunity in women's sports, both commercially and then from a sort of community and brand building perspective. And obviously, I was an athlete as well. And so I've experienced firsthand sort of the impact that team sports can have for women in leadership roles well beyond their playing days. So all of those sort of converged at the right time. And then, Boston Legacy FC started out as Boss Nation. And so I'd been talking to the founders about rebrands and sort of what that process looks like. And turns out there are not that many people who have rebranded professional sports
Well,
teams. And so,
that was going to be my next question. That was obviously,
yeah.
there are some similarities between what was happening with the football team and Boss Nation, the legacy. How much you could talk about that, and what were you talking to the owners about even before you came on?
Well, I think, in some ways these rebrands were similar. In some way they
Yeah,
could not have been more different.
that's a good thing.
Obviously, 90-year club versus a less than 1-year-old club. I think in many ways, the Boston Legacy FC rebrand was easier because sentiment was so consistent and far less sort of nuanced and complex. On the other hand, the bar gets raised higher when there's unified sentiment around a brand. And so I think the stakes felt high because you only get one chance to rebrand. You can't rebrand twice. And so that was one of the first things that I tackled when I got into this job. And it actually was the perfect onboarding project because it let me spend a lot of time. I mentioned earlier that one of the things that I'm so glad we did at the Commanders and that I brought over to the Legacy was deep fan research, stakeholder interviews. And so through that process of qualitative, quantitative surveying, focus groups, conversations with investors, I felt like I really got to know our fans and what they wanted from this brand. And that created a really firm foundation, both for the new brand that we wanted to build, but also the club that we wanted to build more broadly, and how I wanted us to engage with our season ticket members, and, what it looked like when we would show up for partners and all of that. And so in many ways, it was sort of the perfect first project to tackle in my first month.
And what did you learn? What did you learn that the different stakeholders were looking for in brand and the way that you were going to engage with the community?
I think what I heard from our fans was really about values and experience. Fans wanted to feel like this club represented them and was inclusive and welcoming, that it was fun and joyful, and that it felt like a community. And I think we sort of like throw the word community around pretty casually, but there are so few places in our world today where you can go and literally in community with other people who you do not know and share common goals and a common experience. And I think those kinds of places and those kinds of experience are incredibly valuable and worth investing in. And people said it in different ways. Like, I want that feeling of sitting side by side with somebody who I don't know and knowing that we share something. And so community was always going to be a big part of the brand, but that became increasingly clear to me. And it also became increasingly clear that this was not going to be one and done, that we would, yes, we would come up with a new name, but that's sort of only the very start of the work of bringing the brand to life.
That was going to be my next question. How do you build community for something that hasn't existed before? Obviously, this is a new organization. There is an entrenched sports culture in Boston, the Boston area. But how do you build community? Think about those things when they haven't existed before. That's much different than what happened with the football team.
It's really tricky.
Yeah.
It is really, really tricky. And we tried a bunch of different things to just give folks a sense like they were, to help folks feel like they were a part of something. Part of that is building online community, right?
Mm.
Engaging through social media, helping people sort of become part of your digital ecosystem, finding ways for them to engage with you online. Part of it is creating in-person events where folks can come and meet the team and, meet the business side team, meet our GM, learn more about plans for the club. I think a big part of what makes people feel like they are part of a community is they have insider access to information, or they sort of have privileged access to information because they are a part of this cohort. So we tried to create that feeling of both insider access, but also ownership over the future. So like we took a lot of fan input on, you know, um, what we wanted the experience to look like, what the music should be like, things that mattered to them. and that we could incorporate into the game day experience and like actually actioned on them in a way that I think people started to see that positive feedback.
And that you mentioned this before, but what on the quantitative side, when you're building community, launching the brand from scratch, you mentioned surveys, but are there other quantitative sources and are there other data points that you looked at while you're looking to launch the brand, but also launch the team more broadly?
Yeah, definitely. And I think one of the challenges for us and for any new organization is there's so much that you could look at. And I actually found the biggest challenge was getting really disciplined around what questions we wanted to ask and why. And that's an ongoing challenge that I have. But as an executive at a sports team, you have access to so much information at your fingertips, but there's a real difference between information and insight.
Exactly.
And I really try to be disciplined, and I'm not always very good at it, but thinking about, okay, what information do I need to make this decision? Or if I get this information, how might it change what we're doing as a club, as opposed to let me just gather information for information's sake? Because then I think you just get a lot of noise. And so you ask sort of like what beyond surveys, but like the the core question that I wanted to ask and that we're still asking every day, and the answer is evolving, is like, who is our fan? Like demographically, psychographically, what are their behaviors? Like as a new club, you have no idea who your fan is going to be, and they sort of, what it looks like in month one is different in month six, is different than year two, because your fan is not as a static profile, and it's sort of, you know, the different profiles of fans that you have and how they sort of come together and create an identity is like a really living, shifting, breathing entity. And so I feel like that is a question that I am constantly asking myself. Who is my fan? Who's my fan? Who's my fan? And how do I best serve them? Because like the answers to those questions have implications for my team on the partnership side, on the
Exactly.
ticketing side, on the community side. And if you don't understand that core question, it's really hard to stay focused when there's a million things that you could do.
So what are you doing to understand the core question? And even as you've been there, or what has been the evolution of the fan and the fan profile?
The fan profile has certainly evolved in ways that were both predictable and in some ways unpredictable. Part of that is because we are playing actually in two different states this
Yeah,
year,
right.
in two very different types of communities. And so we are constantly being kept on our toes by the realities of
You
being
can,
a part of a startup.
I was gonna say for people who don't know, can you explain your current
Yeah,
stadium?
yeah, yeah. So I mentioned earlier that we are currently in the process of building a new stadium for the club, but also for Boston Public Schools. It will be one of the first dual-use stadiums in the country, where White Stadium, which is right in the heart of Franklin Park, right in Boston, will be a Boston Legacy FC venue on game days, and on non-game days will be a Boston Public Schools venue. And so that got me very excited about having this sort of community that's really a sort of, or this venue is really sort of a civic and community asset, as well as being a state of the art venue for women's sports. But it is not built yet. So we are spending our first season playing at two different venues. We're playing half of our games at Gillette Stadium in Foxborough, where the Patriots and the New England Revolution play, and half of our games at Centerville Bank Stadium in Rhode Island, which is home of Rhode Island FC and is a brand new soccer specific stadium. It's beautiful. But two very different venues. One is 65,000 people, the other is 10,500, obviously in very sort of different communities, different towns. And so understanding what it looks like for us to move from one venue to the other and back again, because we're flip-flopping back and forth, implications for ticket pricing, how we market, how we build our brand, has sort of become my primary focus over the course of the past couple months, because in some ways it does feel like we're actually running two separate races at the same time.
Again, a natural follow-up question, but how do you navigate when you're playing at different stadiums or you're building out different parts of the fan base, knowing that eventually you're going to come back to this third stadium that's not even part of it in a different community? How are you navigating all of those things?
One is just trying to gather as much information as we can. And some of that looks like working with, our agency partners on the media side to understand how fans are responding to our content online, to our paid media, like literally how are people responding to our messaging. Some of it is old school, hand-to-hand grassroots marketing, going out and meeting people at events and at watch parties and asking them what matters to them, asking them what they get excited about. And then some of it is like building trusted partnerships with folks who know both of these regions very well and who know these communities very well. When you're building a new brand, you sort of lean on partners to borrow their brand equity as you establish your own presence. And so finding trusted partners who can vouch for us as being good neighbors in the community, as being a fun experience, as being just sort of a trustworthy entity worth investing your time and money into has gone a long way in terms of us even just being able to connect with potential fans.
Obviously, this is your first season. So, besides the idiosyncratic factor of having all these different stadium developments, are there things that have gone as expected, different than expected, or what has it been like to be on the ground floor of a launch, and how is it different than before you got started?
This is going to sound so obvious that I hesitate to even say it out loud, but when I was working in the NFL and I told people I worked for the Commanders, everybody knew what that was. Everybody knows what the NFL is.
Exactly.
Most people can name most NFL teams. It is so much just a part of the water we drink. And while women's sports are on an absolute rocket ship,
Yeah.
and anybody who's paying attention in the sports industry knows that, there is a there is just a large pool of people out there who don't even know that there is a professional women's soccer league. And so I think I underestimated the very basic work of just communicating to, a city like Boston that is sports crazy, just that women's sports exist, that we have a women's professional soccer team, and, here's where you can watch them play and here's how you can buy tickets. And, that's one of the main differences of going from a 90-year-old brand to a 0-year-old brand is like, turns out over 90 years, a lot of people learn who you are. And you have to concentrate a lot of that brand building and awareness generation, especially when you are trying within the course of about 6 months to launch a brand and then get people to show up at games. Like, you have to move people through that marketing funnel quite rapidly while still building authentic connections with them.
One of the things we did want to cover in terms of building the brand and building the team is the actual stadium itself. You obviously mentioned that with the Commanders or that football team. That was one of the reasons you joined. There's a similar opportunity here. So what have you learned about the stadium development process, mixed use development process? Obviously, you mentioned having a lasting impact, but given the way that the stadium is being built, what do you think about from mixed use development and how does that impact as you're going from 0 to 1 in the Boston area?
I think mixed use development, it just is the future of sports venues. And we have an opportunity actually to do that twice at Boston Legacy. We have our stadium that we're building, which I'll chat about in a minute. And then also we're building a training facility in Brockton, Massachusetts, south of Boston, that will primarily be a dedicated facility for our athletes, but we'll also have fields available for community use and for, youth soccer camps and clinics. And I would love to see over time that the infrastructure for our training facility actually evolves more broadly into more of sort of a traditional mixed use facility that could include, a women's health clinic. Maybe it includes, infrastructure for a women's sports academy or the training facilities required for another professional women's sports team. I think the more that women's sports can think creatively about diverse sources of revenue, that creates a stickiness and just a sort of like viability, for lack of a better word, that will create like a level of longevity and staying power beyond this given moment.
And then you mentioned the stadium itself. Also, within that context, you mentioned that mixed use is the future of sports and stadium development. Why do you think that's the case?
I mean, I come from the NFL where we build these massive stadiums that get used 8 days a year,
Yeah.
and then
But
otherwise
and
sit empty. Yeah, exactly. And I think, obviously anybody who's operating a venue in the NFL or otherwise is thinking about just how do you program it more often, whether that's through concerts, whether it's through other types of live events, but both from a revenue generation perspective, but also like I think of it from also sort of a brand perspective. How do you turn a venue not into just like a building where a team performs, but a community and cultural and civic asset that builds goodwill for both the entity and the club that plays there. And just there's so many benefits, in addition to the obvious financial benefits of like having smoother revenue curves and more predictable, revenue streams. It's like increased utilization just has like so many downstream benefits for every part of the business. And so I think all smart venue operators are just thinking about how do I get this venue full, utilized as many days as possible and as full as possible on as many of those days as I can.
And are you guys thinking about the real estate around the venue, or are you mostly focused about?
We are. So we are going to have a space directly adjacent to White Stadium that we're calling the Grove, which will be a 2,500 person, basically indoor, outdoor space. It will have a full service restaurant that can either be seated or belly up on game day. So on game days, the Grove will be sort of a pregame tailgating area, pregame activation area. But on non-game days, it can be a farmer's market. It can host corporate events. We could put an ice skating rink or do movie nights there. And so that is a space that Boston Legacy FC will own and operate 365 days a year. And I think creates exactly those kinds of opportunities for diverse revenue streams that we've talked about, while also becoming, sort of that civic and community hub. White Stadium is going to be incredible. It will also only be a legacy stadium 20 days a year. And so the Grove really gives us that space to bring the brand to life and to create that diversity and richness of programming all year round.
Do you see any differences? And the answer can definitely be no, between mixed use development and real estate around women's sports versus men's sports. Obviously, there was the opportunity with the Commanders. Are there unique opportunities that either women's sports generally or the Boston Legacy specifically have because it's a women's sports and it's oriented around women's sports as an anchor?
It's a good question and not one that I've thought a lot about. I mean, off the top of my head, I would say there are certainly tenants and partners who might be a more natural fit for a women's sports facility just by nature of the demographics of their clients and customers. And I can see a really powerful business case built around like a mixed use venue specifically targeted at women, which, to be clear, different than women's sports, than fans of women. Not all women are fans of women's sports, and not all women's sports fans are women.
That's what the data said. Yeah.
Yeah. But I that is true. And many fans of women's sports are women. And so if you can create a mixed use venue with that customer in mind, I think that could be really powerful and offer a different opportunity for different types of brands than what currently exists around men's sports. But I think the underlying economics are sort of fundamentally the same.
Last question for you is around women's sports more broadly. You're somebody who is operating with a women's sports team. You're inside the sports industry, specifically working for a women's sports team. You said women's sports is a rocket ship. From your perspective, what does the rocket ship look like, and how to stretch this metaphor? How does it go to the moon, whatever planet you want to go to, so it continues this growth on an ongoing basis?
Yeah, I am all in, obviously. But in terms of the things that need to happen to make the rocket ship keep flying, to further send the metaphor, one is just continued investment from leagues, from owners, from brands, because you do just need to keep the sort of flywheel going of fan experience, player experience. You need the best players and the best environments with the best fan experience. Like that, you can't fake your way out of that. Like that needs to be true for momentum to continue to grow. I think, the women's sports ecosystem needs to continue to be able to attract like great talent on both the business side and on the athlete side. And then I think the last thing that needs to happen is sort of this like embedding of women's sports into broader culture. We need to convert casual fans. Fans of women's sports are some of the most passionate fans I know. We need more of them, but we particularly need those casual fans because that's how you go from being sort of a niche interest to really being a part of popular culture. And when I think about the gap between where women's sports are right now and men's sports, that's where the gap is. It's not in the diehards, it's in those casual fans. And so how we become discoverable for fans and just become something that, when I walk around Boston wearing a Boston Legacy FC hat, everyone sort of knows who we are. That's my goal, and I think what will be required for sustained growth.
And how are you pursuing it, and how should potentially women's sports more broadly consider converting the casual fan into a women's sports fan?
My goal right now in year one is just get as many people as possible to experience the product. As many people as possible. And ideally that's coming to a game, but it also can be watching or streaming one of our games. It can be engaging with us on social media. But I just need more eyeballs on our product because I'm convinced that if you see our athletes play and you see the caliber of talent and the quality of play, you will be hooked. And so that is like my personal thesis that I am operating under and my North Star for year one for us.
Well, glad we got the star to continue the space kind of.
Exactly.
Got that in at the end. So, that's a great place to end. Amina, thank you for joining us. It was great to have you as a guest.
Thank you, Adam. This was a lot of fun.